The dust swirled in angry clouds around the stagecoach as it thundered across the Nevada desert, carrying with it the desperate hopes of 23-year-old Victoria James. She clutched her simple carpetbag tightly against her chest, her knuckles white with tension, eyes darting nervously toward the door. When the coach hit a particularly violent bump, she made her decision. Mason Aldridge watched in disbelief from atop his chestnut stallion as the woman in the blue dress flung open the stagecoach door and leapt into the air. It was 1876, and in his 8 years working cattle in the Nevada territory, he'd never seen anything quite like it. The woman tumbled through the dust, somehow managing to stay on her feet as she grabbed her skirts and began running toward a nearby ridge of scrubby pines. Without thinking, Mason dug his heels into his horse's flanks, spurring the animal toward the fleeing woman. The stagecoach continued on its journey toward Pyramid City, the driver apparently unaware he was now 1 passenger short. As Mason approached the woman, he pulled back on the reins, slowing his horse to match her pace. "Madam," he called out, tipping his hat, "are you running or escaping?" Victoria stopped abruptly, her chest heaving with exertion, hair falling loose from its pins. She studied the cowboy's weathered face, trying to determine if he represented yet another threat or possible salvation. "Does it matter?" she finally asked, her voice surprisingly steady despite her disheveled appearance. Mason dismounted in one fluid motion, keeping a respectful distance between them. "It might. Running suggests you're heading toward something. Escaping means you're fleeing from something or someone." Victoria's eyes narrowed. "And which would earn your assistance, Mr. Aldridge, Mason Aldridge?" He extended a calloused hand. "And I reckon either one might, depending on the circumstances." Victoria hesitated before finally accepting his handshake. "Victoria James." "And I suppose I'm doing a bit of both." Mason nodded thoughtfully. "Well, Miss James, Pyramid City's still 5 miles ahead, and there's a storm brewing." He gestured to the darkening horizon. "I'd be happy to escort you there unless you'd prefer to continue on foot." Victoria glanced at the distant stagecoach, now just a dust cloud on the horizon, then back at Mason's horse. "I don't make a habit of accepting rides from strange men, Mr. Aldridge." A smile creased Mason's sun-bronzed face. "Sensible policy. But I assure you, I'm strange only in the sense that we haven't been properly introduced." He patted his horse's neck. "This here's Copper. He's a gentleman, even if I'm not." Despite herself, Victoria felt a smile tugging at her lips. "And how do I know you won't just take me back to the stagecoach?" "Because you haven't told me why you jumped yet," Mason replied. "And I'm not in the habit of making decisions for folks without knowing their reasons." Victoria considered his words, then nodded slowly. "Very well, Mr. Aldridge. I accept your offer." Mason helped her onto his horse before mounting behind her. As they set off toward Pyramid City, Victoria remained rigidly upright, careful to maintain as much distance as possible between her body and the cowboys. "So," Mason said after they'd ridden in silence for several minutes, "what brings a lady like yourself to jump from a perfectly good stagecoach in the middle of nowhere?" Victoria stared straight ahead. "A lady like myself. Well-bred, educated, Eastern by your accent." "Philadelphia," she confirmed, "and I jumped because continuing on that coach would have been problematic." "Problematic," Mason repeated. "That covers a fair amount of territory." Victoria sighed. "I was traveling to meet my fiancé, or rather the man my father arranged for me to marry. A business associate of his named Theodore Blackwell." "Ah," Mason said, "and you've had a change of heart." "I never had the heart for it in the first place," Victoria admitted, "but my father insisted, said it would secure our family's financial future." "And what about your future?" Victoria turned slightly to look at him. That's precisely what I asked. My father didn't appreciate the question. Mason nodded thoughtfully. So you're running from an unwanted marriage. Can't say I blame you. Mr. Blackwell is 48 years old, Mr. Aldridge. I've never met him, but my father assures me he's a man of means with substantial holdings in Nevada. Her voice had taken on a bitter edge. Apparently, that's all that matters. And what would matter to you? Mason asked quietly. Victoria fell silent for a long moment. I'd like to meet a man before I pledge my life to him, she finally said. I'd like to have a say in my own destiny. They crested a small rise, and Pyramid City came into view in the distance, a collection of wooden buildings nestled in a valley, with the imposing Walker River Range as its backdrop. Well, Miss James, Mason said, Pyramid City isn't Philadelphia, but it's a place where a person can make their own way if they've a mind to. Victoria's eyes widened as she took in the frontier town. And do you live there, Mr. Aldridge? I've got a small ranch about 3 miles outside town, he replied. Nothing fancy, but it's mine. Worked 8 years to build it. As they approached the outskirts of town, Victoria grew increasingly tense. Mr. Aldridge, I realize I've put you in an awkward position. I have no claim on your hospitality beyond this ride. Mason guided his horse down the main street, past the saloon and general store. Do you have lodgings arranged in town? No, Victoria admitted. The plan was to meet Mr. Blackwell's representative at the stage depot. Mason nodded thoughtfully. Well, there's a respectable boarding house run by a widow named Mrs. Porter. She takes in travelers and doesn't ask too many questions. Victoria bit her lip. I have some money, but not much, my father. She trailed off. Controlled the purse strings, Mason finished for her. Yes. They stopped in front of a neat 2-story building with a small sign reading Porter's Boarding House. Mason dismounted and helped Victoria down. Mrs. Porter's fare with her rates, he said. And if you need work, the school's been looking for a teacher since Miss Holloway left to get married last spring. Victoria looked at him in surprise. How do you know I can teach? Mason smiled. The way you speak, the books in your bag. He nodded toward her carpet bag, which had fallen open slightly to reveal several well-worn volumes. Victoria closed the bag quickly. You're observant, Mr. Aldridge. Comes with the territory. A rancher who doesn't pay attention doesn't stay a rancher long. He cleared his throat. Miss James, I don't mean to presume, but if you're worried about Mr. Blackwell's representative finding you, I am, she admitted. Then perhaps we should come up with a story. New arrivals are noticeable in a town this size. Victoria considered this. What would you suggest? You could be my cousin, Mason offered. Come to visit from back east. That would explain why I met your stage. Victoria studied his face. Why would you do that for me? You don't know me. Mason shifted uncomfortably. Let's just say I understand what it's like to want to chart your own course. He gestured toward the boarding house. Shall we get you settled? An hour later, Victoria was installed in a small but clean room at Mrs. Porter's, introduced as my cousin Victoria, visiting from Philadelphia. The widow had accepted this with minimal questioning, though her raised eyebrow suggested she wasn't entirely convinced. I'll come by tomorrow morning, Mason told Victoria as he prepared to leave. We can talk more about arrangements. Victoria nodded, suddenly overwhelmed by the day's events. Thank you, Mr. Aldridge. I don't know what I would have done without your help. Mason tipped his hat. Get some rest, Miss James. Things have a way of looking clearer in the morning. As he rode back to his ranch that evening, Mason found himself thinking about Victoria James and her desperate leap from the stagecoach. There was something about her determination that stirred his admiration, and something about her vulnerability that awakened his protective instincts. Meanwhile, Victoria lay awake in her narrow bed at the boarding house, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of a frontier town settling down for the night. She'd escaped her father's plans for now, but how long could she hide in a town this small? And what would happen when Theodore Blackwell discovered his bride-to-be had fled? Most troubling of all was the realization that she was now dependent on the goodwill of a stranger, a handsome, seemingly kind stranger, but a stranger nonetheless. Victoria had jumped from the stagecoach seeking freedom, only to find herself reliant on Mason Aldridge's protection. As promised, Mason arrived at the boarding house early the next morning. He found Victoria in the small dining room, dressed in the same blue traveling dress, her hair neatly pinned back. She looked more composed than she had the previous day, but the dark circles under her eyes suggested she hadn't slept well. "Good morning, Miss James," he said, removing his hat as he approached her table. "I trust you slept comfortably." Victoria offered a small smile. "As well as could be expected, Mr. Aldridge. Please join me." Mason sat across from her, placing his hat on an empty chair. Mrs. Porter appeared with coffee, giving them both an appraising look before retreating to the kitchen. "I've been thinking about your situation," Mason said once they were alone. "The stage from Carson City arrives every Tuesday and Friday. If Blackwell sent someone to meet you, they'll know by now that you weren't on the coach." Victoria nodded grimly. "And they'll start looking for me." "Most likely," Mason agreed. "Pyramid City isn't large enough to hide in for long." Victoria's fingers tightened around her coffee cup. "What do you suggest?" Mason leaned forward. "I have a friend who works at the telegraph office. I could ask if any messages have come through regarding you." "That would be helpful," Victoria said, "though I hate to involve you further in my troubles." "I'm already involved," Mason pointed out. "Besides, helping a lady in distress is what any gentleman would do." Victoria studied him over the rim of her cup. "Are you a gentleman, Mr. Aldridge? You present yourself as a simple rancher, but there's something in your manner that suggests otherwise." Mason's expression remained neutral, but something flickered in his eyes. "I wasn't always a rancher, but that's a story for another time." He changed the subject. "Have you given any thought to what you'll do now?" "Some," Victoria admitted. "Your suggestion about the teaching position is intriguing. I was educated at a women's seminary in Boston, and I did some tutoring before my father." She trailed off. "Before he decided to marry you off to a stranger," Mason finished for her. "Yes." Victoria set down her cup. "But I can't apply for the position under false pretenses. If I use my real name, Mr. Blackwell will find me." Mason considered this. "What if you used your first name but a different surname? Perhaps James could become your middle name." Victoria thought it over. "Victoria James Porter." "As if I were related to Mrs. Porter." "It might work," Mason agreed. "Mrs. Porter seems the type who'd help a woman in your circumstances." "And what about you, Mr. Aldridge?" Victoria asked directly. "Why are you so willing to help a woman you just met? What do you want in return?" Mason looked genuinely taken aback. "I don't want anything, Miss James. Contrary to what you might think of frontier men, we're not all opportunists." Victoria flushed. "I apologize. That was uncharitable of me." Mason's expression softened. "No apology needed. You're right to be cautious." He rose from the table. "I'll check with my friend at the telegraph office and return this afternoon. In the meantime, it might be best if you stayed indoors." After Mason left, Victoria approached Mrs. Porter about the possibility of using her surname temporarily. To her surprise, the widow readily agreed. "Wouldn't be the first time a woman's had to reinvent herself out here," Mrs. Porter said, wiping her hands on her apron. "Though most don't arrive by jumping off moving stage coaches." Victoria looked at her in alarm. "How did you word travels fast in Pyramid City?" Mrs. Porter said with a shrug. "Don't worry, I won't pry into your reasons. But if you're running from someone, you should know it's hard to stay hidden for long in a town this size." "I'm beginning to realize that," Victoria admitted. Mrs. Porter patted her hand. "Well, you've got Mason Aldridge looking out for you, and that's no small thing. He's one of the good ones." Victoria found herself curious about the cowboy who had come to her rescue. "You know him well." "Everyone knows everyone in Pyramid City," Mrs. Porter said. "But Mason keeps to himself mostly. Came here about 8 years ago, bought that piece of land outside town. Works harder than most men twice his size." She paused. "There's talk he came from money back east, but he never speaks of it." This intrigued Victoria, but before she could ask more questions, Mrs. Porter was called away by another boarder. Victoria retreated to her room, mulling over what she'd learned about Mason Aldridge. That afternoon, Mason returned with troubling news. A telegram arrived this morning addressed to Theodore Blackwell, he told Victoria as they sat in the small parlor of the boarding house. "It was from your father, advising that you had left Philadelphia as planned but failed to arrive on yesterday's stage." Victoria's heart sank. "So he knows I'm missing?" "Yes, but not that you're here," Mason reassured her. "According to my friend, Blackwell is in Carson City on business and won't return until next week. He's arranged for his foreman to search for you along the stage route. How much time do you think I have?" Mason considered this. "A few days at most. Blackwell's ranch is north of here, near the Comstock Lode. He's one of the wealthiest men in the territory." Victoria paled. "I had no idea. My father never mentioned that." "Would it have changed your mind about marrying him?" Mason asked. "No," Victoria said firmly. "I don't care about his wealth. I care about having a choice." Mason nodded. "Then we need to secure your position here before Blackwell returns. I've spoken with Judge Wilson, who serves on the school board. They're desperate for a teacher. He's agreed to meet with you tomorrow morning." Victoria was touched by his efforts. "You've done so much for me already, Mr. Aldridge." "Mason," he corrected her. "If we're supposed to be cousins, you should probably use my given name." "Mason," she repeated, testing the name. "Then you must call me Victoria." "Victoria," he said, and she felt an unexpected warmth at the way he pronounced it. "The judge is a good man, but he'll expect you to be knowledgeable. Are you prepared to discuss your qualifications?" Victoria straightened her shoulders. "I can recite Virgil in the original Latin and solve differential equations. I've read Euclid, Aristotle, and Mary Wollstonecraft. Will that suffice?" Mason's eyebrows rose in admiration. "I believe it will." The next morning, Victoria met with Judge Wilson in the town's small schoolhouse. The building was basic but sound, with rows of rough-hewn desks facing a larger teacher's desk and blackboard. The judge, a portly man with mutton-chop whiskers, questioned her thoroughly about her education and teaching experience. Victoria answered confidently, drawing on her years at seminary and her tutoring work. She emphasized her belief in education for all children, boys and girls alike, and her commitment to teaching practical knowledge alongside classical learning. By the end of the interview, Judge Wilson was clearly impressed. "Miss Porter, Pyramid City would be fortunate to have an educator of your caliber. The position pays $30 a month, with lodging included in the small house behind the school. When can you start?" Victoria glanced at Mason, who had waited outside during the interview and now stood by her side. "Immediately, if that's acceptable." "Excellent," the judge said, offering his hand. "School begins on Monday. That gives you 3 days to prepare." As they walked back to the boarding house, Victoria could barely contain her excitement. "I can't believe it worked. I'm going to be a teacher." Mason smiled at her enthusiasm. "You earned it." The judge was clearly impressed. And having my own lodgings means I won't have to impose on Mrs. Porter's generosity anymore, Victoria added. Mason's expression grew serious. It also means you'll be more visible in town. Once school starts, everyone will know about the new teacher. Victoria's jubilation dimmed. You think Blackwell will hear about me? Eventually, Mason confirmed. But by then, you'll have established yourself here. It would cause quite a scandal for him to force his unwanted attentions on Pyramid City's schoolteacher. Victoria wasn't so sure. You don't know my father or the agreement he made with Mr. Blackwell. There may be legal documents involved. Mason stopped walking and turned to face her. Victoria, I won't let anyone force you to marry against your will. That's not how things work out here. The intensity in his voice stirred something inside her. Thank you, Mason. I want to believe that's true. Over the next few days, Victoria threw herself into preparing for her new role. She reviewed the school's meager collection of books, organized the classroom, and created lesson plans for students ranging from 6 to 16 years of age. The work was engaging and gave her less time to worry about Theodore Blackwell and her father's reaction to her disappearance. Mason visited daily, sometimes bringing supplies for the schoolhouse, a new slate, chalk, books from his own collection. Victoria found herself looking forward to these visits more than she cared to admit. On Sunday evening, the night before school was to begin, Mason invited Victoria to dinner at the town's small restaurant, the Silver Spoon. It was a modest establishment compared to Philadelphia's fine dining, but the food was hearty and well prepared. As they ate, Mason told her about his life as a rancher, the challenges of raising cattle in Nevada's harsh climate, his plans to expand his herd, the satisfaction of building something from nothing. It sounds like you love it, Victoria observed. I do, Mason admitted. Though it's not what I was raised for. Victoria sensed an opening to learn more about his past. Mrs. Porter mentioned you might have come from money. Mason's expression closed slightly. People talk. They do, Victoria agreed. Especially about mysterious cowboys who rescue women from stagecoaches. That earned her a smile. Not much mystery to it. My family owned textile mills in Massachusetts. I was expected to take over the business, marry a society girl, live the life my father had planned for me. Victoria leaned forward, struck by the parallels to her own situation. What happened? Mason's gaze grew distant. I realized I was living someone else's dream, not my own. After my mother died, there was nothing keeping me there. I came west, learned ranching from the ground up. He smiled ruefully. My father disowned me, of course. I'm sorry, Victoria said softly. Mason shrugged. Don't be. I found my place here, built something that's truly mine. Is that why you helped me? Victoria asked. Because you saw yourself in my situation. Partly, Mason admitted. But mostly because no one should be forced into a life they don't want. Their conversation was interrupted by the restaurant owner, who approached their table with an anxious expression. Mr. Aldridge, there's a gentleman asking after you at the bar. Says he works for Theodore Blackwell. Victoria froze, her fork halfway to her mouth. Mason's expression remained calm, but she noticed his shoulders tense. Thank you, Tom, Mason said evenly. Did he say what he wanted? Just that he's looking for a young woman who might have come to town recently, Tom replied, glancing curiously at Victoria. Mason nodded. I'll speak with him shortly. When Tom left, Victoria whispered urgently. What do we do? Stay calm, Mason advised. Finish your meal normally. Then I'll walk you back to the schoolhouse while I find out what this man knows. Victoria forced herself to eat a few more bites, though the food now tasted like ash. When they finally left the restaurant, Mason guided her through the back door and along a side street to avoid being seen. At the schoolhouse, Mason insisted on checking the small attached living quarters before leaving her. "Lock the doors and don't open them for anyone but me," he instructed. "I'll find out what Blackwell's man wants and come back as soon as I can." Victoria nodded, trying to hide her fear. "Be careful, Mason." He touched her cheek gently, the first such gesture between them. "Don't worry. This isn't the first difficult situation I've handled." After Mason left, Victoria paced the small room anxiously. She tried to distract herself by reviewing her lesson plans for the morning, but her mind kept returning to the man asking questions in town. How much did he know? Had someone recognized her from the stagecoach? Nearly 2 hours passed before she heard a soft knock at the door. "Victoria, it's Mason." She rushed to let him in, relief washing over her at the sight of him. "What happened? What did he say?" Mason removed his hat, running a hand through his hair. "His name's Garrett. He works as Blackwell's foreman. He's been sent to find a woman who was supposed to arrive on Friday's stage from Carson City." "Did he describe me?" Victoria asked anxiously. "Only vaguely. Young, well-dressed, traveling alone." Mason's expression was grim. "But he has your name, Victoria James." Victoria sank into a chair. "So he knows who he's looking for." "Yes, but he doesn't know you're here yet," Mason said. "I played ignorant, said I hadn't seen any strangers matching that description." "But tomorrow is my first day of school," Victoria pointed out. "Everyone will see me then." Mason nodded. "That's the problem. Garrett's staying at the hotel for a few days, asking around. It won't take long for someone to mention the new schoolteacher." "What should I do? Cancel classes?" "No," Mason said firmly. "You need to establish yourself here as Victoria Porter. The more people who know you as the schoolteacher, the harder it will be for Blackwell to simply claim you as his bride." Victoria wasn't convinced. "But if this man Garrett recognizes me, he's never seen you before," Mason reminded her. "He only has a name and a vague description." Victoria twisted her hands in her lap. "I'm putting you in a difficult position, Mason. If Blackwell discovers you've helped me." Mason knelt before her chair, taking her hands in his. "Victoria, I made my choice when I rode after you in the desert. I'm not going to abandon you now." Their faces were close, and for a moment Victoria thought he might kiss her. Instead, he squeezed her hands and stood up. "Try to get some sleep," he said. "Tomorrow's an important day. I'll come by in the morning to walk you to school." True to his word, Mason arrived at the schoolhouse at dawn the next day. Victoria was already awake, dressed in her most professional attire, a high-necked navy blue dress with her hair pulled back in a simple bun. She looked every inch the respectable schoolteacher, though her pale complexion betrayed her anxiety. "You look perfect," Mason assured her, offering his arm. "Ready to meet your students?" Victoria took a deep breath. "As ready as I'll ever be." They walked to the schoolhouse together, where several children and their parents were already waiting. Victoria was introduced as Miss Porter, the new teacher from Philadelphia. She greeted each student warmly, memorizing names and faces as they entered her classroom. From the corner of her eye, she noticed Mason speaking quietly with the parents, no doubt reinforcing her false identity. By the time the school bell rang, calling the children to their desks, Victoria felt more confident. This was something she knew how to do, a role she was prepared for. "Good morning, students," she began, her voice steady. "I'm Miss Porter, and I'm honored to be your new teacher." The morning passed quickly as Victoria assessed her students' knowledge and assigned them work appropriate to their levels. By noon, when the children were released for lunch, Victoria felt a growing sense of accomplishment. She could do this. She could build a life here. That feeling was shattered when she stepped onto the schoolhouse porch and saw a stranger watching her from across the street, a tall, weather-beaten man with a sheriff's badge pinned to his vest. Mason appeared at her side as if summoned by her sudden tension. "That's Sheriff Taylor," he murmured. "And beside him is Garrett, Blackwell's foreman." Victoria's heart raced. "They've found me." "Stay calm," Mason advised. "Let me handle this." The two men crossed the street and approached the schoolhouse. Sheriff Taylor tipped his hat respectfully. "Miss Porter, I hear you had a successful first morning." Victoria forced a smile. "Yes, thank you, Sheriff. The children are quite bright." "This is Mr. Garrett," the sheriff continued, gesturing to the man beside him. "He's looking for someone who might have come through town recently." Garrett studied Victoria with narrowed eyes. "You arrived last week, I hear." Before Victoria could answer, Mason stepped forward. "My cousin arrived Tuesday to take the teaching position. Judge Wilson can confirm her appointment." Garrett looked unconvinced. "Your cousin, eh?" "What did you say your name was, madam?" "Victoria Porter," she replied, meeting his gaze steadily. "Funny coincidence," Garrett said. "I'm looking for a Victoria too. Victoria James. Ran off from a stagecoach headed to Mr. Blackwell's ranch." He pulled a paper from his pocket, a simple sketch of a woman's face that bore only a passing resemblance to Victoria. "You haven't seen anyone who looks like this, have you?" Victoria's mouth went dry, but Mason answered smoothly. "Can't say that we have. Right, Victoria?" "No," she managed. "I haven't seen anyone like that." Sheriff Taylor looked between them, his expression thoughtful. "Well, Mr. Garrett, I've asked around town, and no one matching that description has been seen here. Perhaps you should try Silver Springs or Carson City." Garrett folded the sketch and returned it to his pocket. "Perhaps, or perhaps I'll stay a few more days. Mr. Blackwell is most anxious to find his fiancée." After the men left, Victoria's knees nearly buckled with relief. Mason steadied her with a hand at her elbow. "You did well," he murmured. "He suspects something," Victoria whispered. "I could see it in his eyes." "Suspicion isn't proof," Mason said firmly. "Go back to your students, act normally. I'll keep an eye on Garrett." The afternoon dragged on interminably as Victoria taught arithmetic and geography, all the while wondering if Blackwell's man was watching the schoolhouse. When the final bell rang and the children filed out, she was exhausted from the strain of maintaining her composure. Mason appeared as the last student left, closing the door behind him. "Garrett spent the afternoon at the saloon, asking questions," he reported. "He's offering money for information about any woman who arrived recently." Victoria sank into her chair. "Someone will talk eventually." "This town is too small to keep secrets." Mason paced the classroom, thinking, "We need to establish your identity more firmly, make you an indispensable part of Pyramid City." "How?" Victoria asked. "I've only just started teaching." "The Founders' Day celebration is this Saturday," Mason said. "The whole town attends. It would be the perfect opportunity for you to meet everyone, become part of the community." Victoria wasn't convinced. "Or the perfect opportunity for Garrett to confirm his suspicions." "He'll be watching you regardless," Mason pointed out. "Better to have the town on your side when he makes his move." Victoria considered this. "What exactly happens at this celebration? Food, music, dancing. It's to commemorate the founding of Pyramid City after silver was discovered in the mountains." Mason smiled. "There's even a baking contest that Mrs. Porter wins every year with her apple pie." Despite her anxiety, Victoria found herself smiling back. "I make an excellent apple pie myself." "Then you should enter," Mason suggested. "Nothing wins over a frontier town like good food." Over the next few days, Victoria divided her time between teaching and establishing herself in town. She joined the ladies' sewing circle, volunteered to help organize books at the small town library, and began work on her apple pie for the contest. All the while, she was acutely aware of Garrett's presence in town, watching and waiting. Mason kept her informed of the foreman's activities. Garrett had extended his stay at the hotel, claiming he was waiting for Mr. Blackwell to arrive the following week. He continued to ask questions about new arrivals and had shown the sketch to several townspeople. "The good news," Mason told her on Friday evening as they sat on the schoolhouse porch, "is that most folks in town have taken a liking to you. Even if they suspect you're the woman Garrett's looking for, they're not inclined to help him." Victoria was touched by this. "Why would they protect someone they barely know?" Mason chuckled. "You underestimate your impact. The children adore you. Their parents are impressed by how much they've learned in just 1 week, and Mrs. Porter's been singing your praises to anyone who'll listen." "And what about you?" Victoria asked softly. "Why do you continue to risk yourself for me?" In the fading light, Mason's expression was difficult to read. "At first, it was because I saw myself in your situation, someone trying to escape a life others had planned." He paused. "But now?" "Now," Victoria prompted when he didn't continue. Mason shifted closer to her on the porch step. "Now it's because I can't imagine Pyramid City without you." His hand found hers, fingers intertwining. "Can't imagine my life without you in it." Victoria's heart beat faster. "Mason, we've known each other barely a week." "I know," he acknowledged. "It makes no sense. But out here, life moves differently. People show their true selves more quickly when faced with hardship and challenge." His thumb traced circles on her palm. "And everything I've seen of you, Victoria James, tells me you're extraordinary." Hearing her real name on his lips sent a shiver through her. "You hardly know me." "I know enough," Mason said simply. "I know you're brave enough to jump from a moving stagecoach rather than be forced into a life you don't want. I know you're kind enough to devote yourself to teaching children you just met. I know you're determined enough to build a new identity in a strange place." He smiled. "And I know I want to learn everything else about you." Victoria found herself leaning toward him, drawn by the sincerity in his voice. "I feel the same way," she admitted. "Which terrifies me, because my future here is so uncertain." Mason's free hand came up to cup her cheek. "Then let me make one thing certain." Slowly, giving her time to pull away, he leaned forward and pressed his lips to hers. The kiss was gentle, questioning at first, then more assured as Victoria responded. When they finally broke apart, both were breathless. "I shouldn't have done that," Mason said, though he didn't look particularly regretful. "No, you shouldn't have," Victoria agreed, then surprised them both by pulling him back for another kiss. This time when they separated, Mason rested his forehead against hers. "Whatever happens tomorrow or when Blackwell arrives, know that I'm with you. We'll face it together." For the first time since leaping from the stagecoach, Victoria felt truly hopeful about her future. The Founders' Day celebration began at noon the following day. The town square had been transformed with bunting and lanterns, tables laden with food, and a wooden platform where a small band played lively tunes. It seemed everyone in Pyramid City and the surrounding ranches had turned out for the occasion. Victoria arrived with Mrs. Porter, carrying her apple pie for the contest. She wore her best dress, a light green muslin with delicate embroidery at the collar and cuffs. She'd pinned her hair up but left a few curls framing her face, a style less severe than her schoolteacher appearance. Mason found her immediately, his admiring gaze making her blush. "You look beautiful," he said, offering his arm. "May I show you around?" As they walked through the celebration, Mason introduced Victoria to ranchers and miners he knew from the area. She was welcomed warmly, with many parents thanking her for her work with their children. By the time the pie contest began, Victoria felt almost as if she belonged. The contest was judged by Mayor Paulson and his wife, along with Judge Wilson. to everyone's surprise, especially Mrs. Porter's. Victoria's apple pie took first prize. "It's the nutmeg," Victoria confided to the disappointed widow, "and a splash of lemon juice to brighten the flavor." Mrs. Porter eyed her speculatively. "Well, I never. Seems you have hidden talents, Miss Porter." As Victoria accepted congratulations from the crowd, she noticed Garrett watching her from the edge of the square. His gaze was calculating, and she knew instinctively that he had made the connection between her and the missing bride. Mason noticed her tension and followed her gaze. "Don't worry," he murmured. "He can't do anything in front of the whole town." The afternoon progressed into evening with lanterns lit and the band playing dance tunes. Mason led Victoria into a lively reel, then a slower waltz. As they moved together, Victoria momentarily forgot her troubles, lost in the music and Mason's arms. Their moment of peace was shattered by a commotion at the edge of the square. A large carriage had arrived, and from it emerged an imposing figure, a tall man in an expensive suit, his silver hair gleaming in the lantern light. "Blackwell," Mason whispered, his arm tightening around Victoria's waist. Victoria felt the blood drain from her face as Theodore Blackwell surveyed the gathering, his cold eyes scanning the crowd. Garrett appeared at his side, speaking rapidly and pointing in their direction. "We need to leave," Mason said urgently, guiding her toward the edge of the dance area. But it was too late. Blackwell had spotted them and was striding purposefully through the crowd, Garrett and Sheriff Taylor in his wake. "Miss James," Blackwell called out, his voice carrying across the square. "Or should I say Miss Porter?" The music faltered as people turned to stare. Victoria straightened her spine and faced him, conscious of Mason's solid presence beside her. "Mr. Blackwell, I presume," she said coolly. Blackwell stopped before them, his expression a mixture of anger and satisfaction. "Indeed. I've come to collect my fiancée." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Sheriff Taylor stepped forward. "What's going on here, Mr. Blackwell?" "This woman," Blackwell said, pointing at Victoria, "is Victoria James, my betrothed. She fled the stagecoach rather than fulfill her obligation to me. Her father and I have a binding agreement." Victoria's voice was steady despite her racing heart. "An agreement made without my consent." "Your consent is immaterial," Blackwell snapped. "Sheriff, I demand you enforce the law. This woman is legally bound to me." Sheriff Taylor looked uncomfortable. "Mr. Blackwell, I'm not sure this is a matter for law enforcement." "Perhaps this will clarify things," Blackwell said, producing a document from his coat pocket. "A legal contract between myself and Philip James, regarding the marriage of his daughter Victoria to me in exchange for financial considerations." Judge Wilson had joined them and examined the document. "This appears to be a legitimate contract, Sheriff." Victoria felt her hopes crumbling. Mason stepped forward. "Judge, a woman isn't property to be bargained for." "The law says otherwise, Mr. Aldridge," Blackwell said dismissively. "Now stand aside." Mason didn't move. "Victoria has built a life here. She's our school teacher. The children need her." "She can find a replacement," Blackwell said coldly. "Victoria, come with me now, or I'll be forced to take more drastic measures." Victoria looked around at the townspeople watching the confrontation. Some looked confused, others sympathetic. Mrs. Porter stood nearby, her expression determined. Judge Wilson seemed troubled by the document in his hands. "I won't go with you," Victoria said firmly. "I don't recognize that contract as binding, as I was never consulted." Blackwell's face hardened. "Sheriff, arrest this woman for breach of contract." Sheriff Taylor hesitated. "Mr. Blackwell, I'm not sure. Are you refusing to uphold the law?" Blackwell demanded. Before the sheriff could answer, Mason spoke up. "There's another solution." He turned to Victoria, his expression intense. "Marry me instead." Victoria stared at him in shock. What? If you're already married, the contract with Blackwell is void, Mason explained. Judge Wilson can perform the ceremony right now. Blackwell's face reddened with anger. This is preposterous. The contract cannot be enforced if the lady is already wed to another, Judge Wilson finished, looking suddenly hopeful. That's correct, Mr. Aldridge. Victoria's mind raced. Marriage to Mason would free her from Blackwell, but it would also bind her to a man she'd known for barely a week. Yet when she looked into Mason's eyes, she saw not just determination to help her, but something deeper, the same feelings that had been growing in her own heart. Victoria, Mason said softly, taking her hands in his. I know this isn't how either of us planned it. But I meant what I said last night. I can't imagine my life without you in it. He dropped to one knee, still holding her hands. Will you marry me? Not just to escape Blackwell, but because I think we could build something wonderful together. The crowd had grown silent, watching the drama unfold. Victoria was aware of Blackwell's furious gaze, of the townspeople holding their breath, of Judge Wilson standing ready to officiate. But most of all, she was aware of Mason, honest, brave Mason, offering her not just escape, but a future. Yes, she said, her voice clear and certain. I will marry you, Mason Aldridge. A cheer went up from the crowd. Judge Wilson immediately stepped forward. Let's proceed then, before there are any further objections. Blackwell was livid. This is a sham, a transparent attempt to circumvent a legal agreement. Nevertheless, the judge said firmly, if these two wish to be married, I have the authority to perform the ceremony. With the entire town as witnesses, Victoria and Mason exchanged vows beneath the lantern light. When Judge Wilson pronounced them husband and wife, Mason kissed her with a tenderness that brought tears to her eyes. Blackwell, seeing his plans thwarted, stormed toward them. This isn't over. I'll have my lawyers contest this mockery of a marriage. Mason faced him squarely. You're welcome to try. But Victoria is my wife now, legally and in the eyes of everyone in this town. Mrs. Porter stepped forward, standing protectively near Victoria. And we take care of our own in Pyramid City, Mr. Blackwell. Other townspeople moved to stand with them, the parents of Victoria's students, the shopkeepers she'd befriended, even Sheriff Taylor. The message was clear. Victoria was now one of them, under their protection. Blackwell looked around at the unified front against him and seemed to realize he was outnumbered. This will have consequences, he warned before turning on his heel and striding back to his carriage, Garrett following behind. As the carriage pulled away, Victoria sagged with relief. Mason's arm came around her waist, supporting her. Are you all right? He asked quietly. Victoria nodded, still processing what had just happened. I'm married, she said wonderingly. Mason's expression grew uncertain. I know it wasn't what you planned when you jumped from that stagecoach. If you want, we can have it annulled once Blackwell gives up his pursuit. Victoria looked up at the man who had risked everything to help her, who had offered her not just protection but partnership. In his eyes, she saw the same mix of hope and fear that she felt. I don't want an annulment, she said softly. Do you? Mason's face broke into a smile that warmed her to her toes. Not for all the gold in Nevada. The band struck up a lively tune, and the celebration resumed around them. Mason led Victoria back to the dance area, holding her closer than propriety might dictate, but then they were married now. Mrs. Aldridge, he murmured as they moved to the music. How does that sound? Victoria smiled up at him. Like freedom. Later that night, Mason took Victoria to his ranch outside town. The house was modest but well built, with a comfortable sitting room, a kitchen with a cast iron stove, and 2 bedrooms. It's not what you're used to in Philadelphia, Mason said, watching nervously as Victoria explored the rooms. Victoria ran her hand along a bookshelf filled with well-worn volumes Shakespeare, Dickens, Thoreau. "It's perfect," she said sincerely. "It feels like a home." Mason visibly relaxed. "I built most of it myself. Added the second bedroom last year," he hesitated, "which you're welcome to use." "I don't expect. That is, I know our marriage was sudden." Victoria turned to face him, touched by his consideration. "Mason, when I agreed to marry you, it wasn't just to escape Blackwell. I meant those vows." Mason stepped closer, his eyes never leaving hers. "So did I." Their kiss was different from the ones they'd shared before, deeper, with the knowledge that they had time to explore these feelings, to build a life together. Later, as they lay together in the quiet darkness of Mason's, now their bedroom, Victoria told him about her life in Philadelphia, about her mother's death when she was 16, about her father's increasing control over her life. "He wasn't always so cold," she said, her head resting on Mason's chest. "After my mother died, something changed in him. It was as if he stopped seeing me as a daughter and started seeing me as an asset to be managed." Mason's hand stroked her hair. "I'm sorry. No one deserves to be treated that way." "What about your family?" Victoria asked. "You mentioned your father disowned you. Do you ever regret leaving?" Mason was quiet for a moment. "I regret the breach with my father, not the choice I made. He couldn't understand why I would abandon what he saw as my birthright to live in the wilderness, as he called it." "Do you think he'll ever change his mind?" "I doubt it," Mason said. "He's a proud man, but I've made my peace with it. I found my place here." He pressed a kiss to her forehead. "And now I've found you." The following days settled into a new routine. Victoria continued teaching at the schoolhouse while living at Mason's ranch. Each morning, they rode to town together, and each evening they returned home, sharing the details of their day over dinner. Word came that Blackwell had indeed consulted lawyers about contesting the marriage, but had been advised that his case was weak. A week after the Founders' Day celebration, he left Nevada territory altogether, reportedly returning to San Francisco, where he had other business interests. "Do you think he's truly given up?" Victoria asked when Mason brought her the news. "I think he's a businessman," Mason replied, "and he's decided you're not worth the cost or effort anymore." Victoria should have been relieved, but instead she felt a strange melancholy. "I wonder if my father knows yet that his plans failed." Mason took her hand. "Would you like to write to him? Let him know you're safe and happy." Victoria considered this. "Perhaps. Not yet, but someday." As autumn progressed into winter, Victoria and Mason settled deeper into their life together. The ranch prospered under their combined efforts, Mason managing the cattle, Victoria starting a vegetable garden, and keeping the accounts with her precise mathematical mind. They worked as partners, each bringing their strengths to their shared enterprise. In town, Victoria had become a beloved figure. Her students were advancing rapidly under her guidance, and she'd started an evening class for adults who wanted to improve their reading and writing. Mason often joined these sessions, not as a student but as an assistant teacher, revealing a patience and kindness that made Victoria love him even more. When the first snow fell in early December, they celebrated with a small dinner party, inviting Mrs. Porter, Judge Wilson, and Sheriff Taylor to the ranch. As their guests admired the Christmas decorations Victoria had arranged around the house, Mason pulled her aside into the kitchen. "I have something for you," he said, looking uncharacteristically nervous. From his pocket, he produced a small velvet box. "Mason, what's this?" Victoria asked. "Open it," he urged. Inside was a delicate gold ring set with a small diamond. "I know we're already married," Mason said, "but that happened so quickly you never got a proper ring." And I wanted you to have something that symbolizes not just our hasty wedding, but what's grown between us since." Victoria's eyes filled with tears as he slid the ring onto her finger, alongside the plain band Judge Wilson had provided for their ceremony. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "But not as beautiful as the life you've given me." Mason's eyes darkened with emotion. "You've given me just as much, Victoria. Purpose, partnership, love." He kissed her gently. "I never expected to find all that when I saw a woman jump from a stagecoach." Victoria laughed, resting her forehead against his. "And I never expected that the cowboy who rode after me would become my husband, my best friend, my home." Their guests called from the other room, wondering what was keeping them. Mason and Victoria rejoined the party, sharing knowing smiles across the table as Mrs. Porter commented on Victoria's new ring. Later that night, after their guests had departed and they were alone before the fireplace, Victoria had news of her own to share. "Mason," she said, taking his hand and placing it over her still flat stomach, "I'm going to have a baby." Mason stared at her in wonder before gathering her into his arms. "A baby," he repeated, his voice thick with emotion. "Our baby." Victoria nodded, her own eyes shining with happy tears. "Due in early summer, according to Mrs. Porter's calculations." Mason kissed her deeply, then pulled back to look at her with such love that Victoria felt it like a physical warmth. "When you jumped from that stagecoach, did you ever imagine this would be your life 6 months later?" Victoria thought about that desperate leap into the unknown, how terrified she'd been, how alone. "Never," she admitted. "I was just running away. I had no idea I was actually running toward something so wonderful." "Are you running or escaping?" Mason murmured, echoing the question he'd asked her that first day in the desert. Victoria smiled, resting her head against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. "Neither," she said softly. "I'm home." Spring came early to Pyramid City in 1877. The desert bloomed with wildflowers, and Victoria's garden flourished under her careful tending. Her condition was now visible, and her students were excitedly speculating about whether their teacher would have a boy or a girl. On a warm May afternoon, as Victoria was preparing to close the schoolhouse for the day, she was surprised by a visitor, a well-dressed older man with familiar features that made her heart stutter. "Father," she said, her hand automatically going to her rounded belly. Philip James looked older than when she'd last seen him, the lines in his face deeper, his hair grayer. His eyes moved from her face to her stomach, then around the simple schoolroom with its rows of desks and children's artwork decorating the walls. "Victoria," he said formally. "I've been looking for you." Victoria straightened her shoulders. "How did you find me?" "Theodore Blackwell eventually informed me what happened," Philip said stiffly. "It took some time to arrange my affairs for travel." Victoria gestured to a chair. "Please sit down." "The walk back to the ranch is too far in my condition." Philip sat awkwardly, his expensive suit out of place in the frontier schoolhouse. "So it's true, you married this rancher." "His name is Mason Aldridge," Victoria said, a protective edge entering her voice. "And yes, I married him. I'm carrying his child." Philip's expression was unreadable. "And are you happy in this place?" Victoria considered her father's question. Was she happy? In this small town, so far from the cultured society she'd been raised in her simple life as a teacher and rancher's wife. "Yes," she said with certainty. "Happier than I ever imagined possible." Something shifted in Philip's eyes, regret, perhaps, or understanding. "Your mother would be pleased to hear that. She always wanted your happiness above all else." Victoria felt tears threatening. "Why are you here, Father?" "If you've come to take me back—" "No," Philip interrupted. "I've come to see you, to apologize." The word seemed to cost him effort. What I did arranging that marriage without your consent was wrong. I see that now." Victoria was stunned into silence. Her father had never apologized to her for anything in her life. "After you left," Philip continued, "I received a letter from your mother's sister, your Aunt Elizabeth. She had some rather harsh words for me about how I'd treated you, made me see things differently." He paused. "I was trying to secure your future. I never considered what you wanted that future to be." "Thank you for saying that," Victoria said quietly. "It means more than you know." An awkward silence fell between them, 23 years of misunderstanding and missed connections impossible to bridge in a single conversation. "Will you stay in town for a while?" Victoria finally asked. "I'd like you to meet Mason." Philip looked surprised by the invitation. "If you wish it." "I've taken a room at the hotel." "Come to dinner tonight," Victoria offered. "Our ranch isn't grand, but we set a good table." Philip accepted, and that evening, Victoria watched with amazement as her stern Philadelphia father and her frontier husband found unexpected common ground discussing cattle markets and business investments. Mason, always perceptive, gave father and daughter time alone after dinner, claiming the need to check on a pregnant mare. "He seems a good man," Philip admitted when they were alone. "Not what I would have chosen for you, but a good man." Victoria smiled. "He is the best of men." "He saw me for who I was from the very beginning." Philip looked pained. "While I saw only what I wanted you to be." He reached into his coat and withdrew an envelope. "I've brought you this. It's the deed to your mother's property in Boston. She always intended it for you." Victoria accepted the envelope with surprise. "Father, I don't need—" "I know," Philip interrupted. "You've made a life here without my help, but it's yours by right. Do with it what you will sell it, keep it as an investment. The choice is yours." Victoria recognized the gesture for what it was: not just a financial gift, but an acknowledgement of her independence, her right to make her own decisions. "Thank you," she said simply. Philip stayed in Pyramid City for a week, gradually becoming more comfortable with his daughter's new life. He attended Sunday services with Victoria and Mason, met her students when he visited the schoolhouse, and even rode out with Mason to see the ranch operations. On his last evening before departing for Philadelphia, Philip made an unexpected request. "I would like to stay in touch, Victoria. Perhaps you could write to me from time to time. Tell me about my grandchild when it arrives." Victoria felt a knot of emotion in her throat. "I would like that very much." After her father left, Victoria found herself reflecting on the winding path that had led her to this life. If she hadn't taken that desperate leap from the stagecoach, if Mason hadn't ridden after her, if they hadn't faced down Theodore Blackwell together, how different things might have been. "Penny, for your thoughts," Mason said, joining her on the porch where she sat watching the sunset paint the desert in gold and crimson. Victoria smiled up at her husband. "I was just thinking about how one moment of courage can change everything." Mason sat beside her, his hand finding hers. "Jumping from that stagecoach was the bravest thing I've ever witnessed," Victoria laughed. "It was either brave or foolish. I'm still not sure which." "Both, probably," Mason admitted with a grin, "but I'm grateful for it every day." 3 weeks later, on a warm June morning, Victoria gave birth to a healthy baby boy they named Thomas Philip Aldridge. As she held her son in her arms, Mason sitting beside her on the bed, his arm protectively around her shoulders, Victoria felt a sense of completion she had never known before. "He's perfect," Mason whispered, gently touching his son's tiny hand. "Just like his mother." Victoria leaned into her husband's embrace, their child cradled between them. "I never imagined I could be this happy," she confessed. Mason pressed a kiss to her temple. "When I asked if you were running or escaping, I never thought to ask what you were running toward." Victoria smiled down at their sleeping son. "This," she said softly, "all of this." Outside their window, the Nevada sun rose higher in the sky, illuminating the land they now shared, not the life either of them had been born to, but the one they had chosen together, a choice that began with a leap of faith and a cowboy who cared enough to ask the right question. In the years that followed, Victoria and Mason's ranch prospered, becoming one of the most successful operations in the region. Victoria continued teaching until their second child, a daughter named Elizabeth, arrived 2 years after Thomas. She then focused on raising their children and managing the growing ranch accounts, though she still volunteered at the school regularly. Philip James visited every summer, gradually becoming the doting grandfather no one would have expected. He even invested in Mason's plans to expand the ranch, a gesture of respect that meant more to both men than the money itself. On the 5th anniversary of their hasty wedding at the Founders' Day celebration, Mason surprised Victoria with a proper ceremony, this time planned and attended by friends and family, including her father. Under an arbor Mason had built with his own hands, they renewed the vows they had made in desperation but had lived with devotion. "I jumped from a stagecoach to find freedom," Victoria said as they danced under the stars afterward. "But I found so much more. I found you, and in you I found home." Mason pulled her closer, his love for her as strong as the day he'd first seen her leap into the unknown. "And I'm forever grateful that I was in the right place, at the right time, to ask the right question." Victoria smiled up at him, thinking of all they had built together from that chance beginning. "Are you running or escaping?" she echoed softly. "Neither," Mason replied, bending to kiss her. "We're exactly where we're supposed to be."